September 17, 1961. The most powerful diplomat in the world boards a plane that will never land. His name is Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, and in just a few hours he will be dead. But this is not a story about an accident. This is a story about murder, covered up by governments for over 60 years. And it begins with a secret flight into the heart of Africa. The Swedish DC-6 aircraft, codenamed Albertina, sits on the tarmac at Leopoldville Airport in the Congo. 16 people prepare to board. The mission is so classified that Hammarskjöld travels under a false name. Even the flight crew doesn't know who their passenger really is. They're about to find out why secrecy matters. At exactly 4:51 p.m., the Albertina's engines roar to life. The plane lifts off into clear skies, beginning what should be a routine 3-hour flight to Ndola in northern Rhodesia. The pilot, Captain Per Hallenquist, is one of Sweden's most experienced aviators. He has flown this route before. He knows every landmark, every radio beacon. Nothing about this flight should go wrong. But 300 miles away, other eyes are watching. Intelligence operatives from at least 3 countries are tracking the Albertina's progress. Some want Hammarskjöld to reach his destination. Others are desperate to ensure he never arrives. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, someone is preparing to act. The Albertina climbs to cruising altitude. Inside, Hammarskjöld reviews his notes for tomorrow's meeting. He's about to negotiate the end of a war that threatens to tear the Congo apart. If he succeeds, it will be his greatest achievement. If he fails, it could mean the collapse of the United Nations itself. He doesn't know that failure and success have both become impossible. Because in less than 6 hours, the Albertina will be scattered across an African forest. 15 bodies will be found still strapped into their seats. One man will survive just long enough to tell a story that changes everything. And the evidence that could explain what really happened will vanish into classified files that remain sealed to this day. The sun sets over the Congo. The Albertina flies on through gathering darkness. And the clock is ticking toward a moment that will haunt the United Nations for generations. But to understand why someone wanted Dag Hammarskjöld dead, we need to go back. Back to the man he was and the forces he was fighting. Because this plane crash wasn't random. It was the culmination of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Western intelligence. And it all started with a decision Hammarskjöld made 2 years earlier, a decision that signed his death warrant. 1953. The United Nations is barely 8 years old and already dying. The organization created to prevent another world war has become a stage for Cold War theater, a place where diplomats give speeches and nothing actually happens. The major powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, want to keep it that way. They need a Secretary General who will follow orders and stay out of their way. They choose Dag Hammarskjöld because they think he's perfect for the job. He's Swedish, from a neutral country with no colonial history. He's an economist and bureaucrat, not a politician. He quotes medieval mystics and writes poetry in his spare time. The British Foreign Office describes him as a safe pair of hands. The Americans think he'll be manageable. They're about to discover how wrong they are. Within months of taking office, Hammarskjöld does something unprecedented. He begins actually using the powers the UN Charter gives him. When American pilots are imprisoned in China, he flies to Beijing personally and negotiates their release, without asking Washington's permission. When the Suez Crisis erupts, he doesn't wait for the Security Council to act. He creates the first UN peacekeeping force on his own authority. The major powers are stunned. This quiet Swedish poet has more courage than any diplomat they've ever encountered. He believes the United Nations can actually stop wars, actually protect the weak from the strong. And he's willing to defy anyone, including the countries that appointed him, to make that vision real. By 1960, Dag Hammarskjöld has become the most powerful unelected official in the world. That's when the Congo explodes, and everything changes, because the Congo isn't just another former colony struggling with independence. It's the richest prize in Africa, home to vast deposits of copper, cobalt, diamonds, and uranium. The Western powers have spent decades extracting this wealth. They're not about to let a UN diplomat tell them to stop. June 30th, 1960. Belgium grants independence to the Congo after 75 years of brutal colonial rule. Within a week, the Congolese army mutinies. Belgian troops intervene to protect white settlers. And then the province of Katanga, where most of the mineral wealth is concentrated, declares independence under a leader named Moise Tshombe. On the surface, Katanga's secession looks like an internal African conflict. But Hammarskjöld sees what's really happening. Tshombe is a puppet. Behind him stands Union Minière, a Belgian mining corporation with a private army and intelligence network. Behind Union Minière stand British and American mining interests. Behind them all, intelligence agencies with orders to keep the Congo's resources in Western hands. Hammarskjöld makes a decision that will cost him his life. He commits UN peacekeepers to the Congo, with orders to reunify the country and end Katanga's secession. He's not just defying one government. He's defying the entire structure of Western control over African resources. And the people he's challenging don't lose gracefully. CIA memos from this period describe Hammarskjöld as increasingly dangerous and naive about communist infiltration. British intelligence files, the ones that have been declassified, discuss the Hammarskjöld problem. Belgian operatives begin tracking his movements. And in Katanga, white mercenary pilots start flying combat missions against UN forces. By September 1961, the situation has reached a crisis point. UN peacekeepers and Katangan forces are engaged in open combat. Hammarskjöld needs to end this before it destroys the United Nations. He arranges a secret meeting with Moise Tshombe in Douala. The plan is to negotiate Katanga's peaceful return to the Congo. Intelligence agencies across 3 continents learn about the meeting, some through official channels, others through spies embedded in the UN itself. And as Hammarskjöld boards the Albertina on September 17th, a question hangs in the air. Will he be allowed to reach Douala? Or has someone already decided that this diplomat who wouldn't bend must finally be broken? 10:15 p.m., September 17th, 1961. Air traffic control in Douala receives a radio transmission from the Albertina. Captain Hallenquist reports he's beginning his descent for landing. The controller acknowledges and prepares the runway lights. It's a routine exchange, the kind that happens thousands of times every day at airports around the world. But the Albertina never calls again. The controller waits for the next transmission. The one confirming the aircraft is on final approach. Silence. He tries calling the Albertina. No response. He checks his equipment, thinking perhaps the radio has malfunctioned. Everything works perfectly. The Albertina has simply stopped communicating. Midnight passes, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. The controller alerts his supervisor that a UN aircraft carrying the Secretary General has failed to land and isn't responding to calls. You would expect this to trigger an immediate, massive emergency response. Search aircraft in the sky within minutes. Ground teams mobilized. Every available resource devoted to finding Hammarskjöld. That's not what happens. The response is strangely delayed, almost casual. The first search aircraft doesn't take off until after sunrise. Ground teams aren't dispatched until mid-morning. And when they finally begin searching, they focus on the wrong areas, looking for wreckage along the flight path from the north when witnesses will later report seeing fire to the southwest. Here's what makes this delay truly suspicious. The Albertina was carrying the head of the United Nations. Its flight was being monitored by multiple intelligence agencies. The plane went silent 9 miles from the airport. Even in 1961, finding a downed aircraft that close to a major city should take hours at most, not the 15 hours it actually took. 15 hours. While Dag Hammarskjöld and 15 others lay dead in the African bush, while one man clung to life with information that could explain everything, search teams flew over the crash site repeatedly without seeing anything. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing fire in the forest that night. The smoke should have been visible for miles in daylight. Yet somehow, professional search crews missed it again and again. When they finally locate the wreckage at 3 p.m. on September 18th, what they find doesn't make sense. The DC-6 is destroyed, scattered across a small clearing 9 miles southwest of the Ndola airport. The aircraft hit the ground at a steep angle, almost vertical. This is not what you expect from a plane making a normal landing approach. All 16 passengers and crew are accounted for. 15 are dead. Most are still strapped into their seats, killed on impact. The captain and co-pilot are found in the cockpit, their bodies showing the trauma of a high-speed crash. Everything appears consistent with a tragic accident during landing. But then the rescue teams find him. Harold Julian, an American security officer working for the UN. He's badly burned and barely conscious, but he's alive, and he's trying to say something. The rescuers lean close to hear his words. What Harold Julian tells them over the next 6 days will turn the official story of pilot error into a murder investigation. But first, someone needs to listen. Someone needs to write down his testimony and treat it as evidence. That's about to become a problem, because the people who arrive to investigate this crash aren't looking for the truth. They're looking for a way to bury it. And Harold Julian, the only witness to what happened in those final moments, is dying. He has less than a week to tell his story. Whether anyone will believe him is another question entirely. Harold Julian drifts in and out of consciousness in a hospital bed in Ndola. His burns are severe. His internal injuries are catastrophic. The doctors know he's dying, but for 6 days he keeps fighting, kept alive by something more powerful than medicine. He needs to tell someone what he saw. The first testimony comes on September 18th, just hours after the rescue. A local police officer sits by Julian's bedside and takes notes. Julian describes the final minutes of the flight. He talks about being comfortable in his seat, about the plane beginning its descent. And then he says something that changes everything. There were explosions, multiple explosions. Julian describes seeing flashes of light, hearing loud bangs, feeling the aircraft shudder violently. He talks about sparks in the cabin, about fire spreading along the fuselage. This isn't pilot error. This is something else entirely. The police officer writes it down, but he doesn't take a formal sworn statement. He doesn't have recording equipment to preserve Julian's exact words. And crucially, he doesn't immediately alert higher authorities that the only survivor is describing what sounds like an attack on the aircraft. The testimony exists, but it's trapped in fragmentary notes that will later be easy to dismiss. Over the next few days, other visitors come to Julian's bedside. UN officials, Rhodesian investigators, medical staff. Several of them later recall Julian mentioning explosions, fire, sparks, but none of them create an official record. None of them treat his words as critical evidence in what might be a murder investigation. They listen, they nod, and they leave. Why? Why does no one take this seriously? Julian is describing the death of the UN Secretary General in terms that suggest foul play. This should trigger an immediate international investigation. Instead, it's treated as the confused ramblings of a dying man, unreliable and probably distorted by trauma. On September 24th, 6 days after the crash, Harold Julian dies from his injuries. He's taken his full testimony to the grave. What remains is a handful of unofficial notes, conflicting in details easy to discredit. And that's exactly what happens. When the Rhodesian Board of Investigation begins its formal inquiry, they acknowledge Julian's statements about explosions. Then they dismiss them. The official report suggests Julian was confused, that he mistook the sounds of impact for explosions, that his testimony is unreliable due to his injuries. Case closed. But Julian wasn't the only witness. While investigators are busy dismissing his account, other people are coming forward. People who weren't on the plane but who were on the ground that night. And their testimony is remarkably consistent. A charcoal burner named Saflin Bew was working in the forest near the crash site. He heard the sound of aircraft engines around 10:15 p.m. Then he heard something else. Rapid bursts of sound like machine gun fire. Then an explosion. Then he saw fire falling from the sky. Other villagers report similar experiences. They describe seeing an aircraft on fire before it hit the ground. Some mention a smaller plane in the area flying fast and low. Several people talk about hearing unusual sounds, not the normal engine noise of a large aircraft, but something sharper, more violent. This is crucial corroborating evidence. These witnesses weren't on the Albertina, so they can't be dismissed as confused or traumatized. They're independent observers describing the same thing Harold Julian reported: an aircraft in distress before impact, consistent with an attack rather than pilot error. The Rhodesian investigation ignores them. Their testimony doesn't appear in the official report. For decades, it's as if these witnesses never existed. And by the time researchers finally tracked them down in the 1990s, most are dead, their memories faded, their evidence lost to time. But in September 1961, their testimony is fresh and specific. And someone makes a deliberate decision not to include it in the official investigation. This isn't negligence. This is active suppression of evidence, which raises an uncomfortable question. What else did investigators find that never made it into the official report? What physical evidence from the crash site was conveniently overlooked? And most importantly, what did they already know about who might have wanted Hammarskjöld dead? The Rhodesian Board of Investigation convenes in late September 1961, just days after the crash. On paper, this is a serious inquiry into a major aviation disaster. The chairman is a respected judge. Technical experts examine the wreckage. Witnesses are interviewed. Everything looks proper and thorough. But beneath the surface, something is very wrong. Because this investigation isn't designed to find the truth. It's designed to reach a specific conclusion. And that conclusion has already been decided before the first witness testifies. The timeline alone is suspicious. Major aircraft investigations typically take months or even years. The Albertina inquiry wraps up in 6 weeks. On November 2, 1961, the board releases its findings. Cause of crash: pilot error. Captain Hallenquist descended too early, possibly distracted or disoriented. No evidence of foul play, no evidence of mechanical failure, just a tragic mistake. Case closed. Except the evidence doesn't support this conclusion. Not even close. The board's own technical findings contradict the narrative of pilot error. But these contradictions are buried in appendices and technical reports that few people read. Start with the impact pattern. When a plane crashes during a normal landing approach because the pilot descends too early, it typically hits the ground at a shallow angle. The aircraft is still in controlled flight, just too low. The wreckage spreads out along the flight path, showing the plane was trying to land. The Albertina shows the opposite pattern. The impact angle is steep, almost vertical. The wreckage is concentrated in a small area. This is consistent with an aircraft that lost control at altitude and went into a dive, not with a controlled descent that went wrong. Then there's the fire damage. Post-crash fuel fires burn in predictable patterns. They spread along the ground where fuel has spilled. They're hottest near the fuel tanks. The Albertina shows fire damage that doesn't match this pattern. Some areas show intense, localized heat inconsistent with burning aviation fuel, almost as if something else caused the fire. The board acknowledges these anomalies in its technical report. Then it ignores them in its conclusions. Pilot error remains the official verdict, despite physical evidence that contradicts it. And when challenged on this, the board falls back on a simple defense. There's no proof of anything else. This is technically true. There's no proof because the board never seriously investigated alternatives. They never asked, what if this wasn't an accident? They never examined the wreckage for evidence of explosion or sabotage. They never followed up on witness reports of other aircraft. They never questioned why it took 15 hours to find wreckage 9 miles from the airport. Instead, they focused on Captain Hallenquist. They questioned whether he was tired, whether the cockpit instruments might have confused him, whether he might have been distracted. They built a narrative around human error because human error is simple, explainable, and doesn't implicate anyone important. But here's what the board couldn't explain. Hammarskjöld's briefcase, containing all his notes for the Chambé meeting, was never found. His personal papers from the flight disappeared. critical pieces of the aircraft that might have shown evidence of explosion or gunfire were never forensically examined. Most tellingly, the investigation never seriously pursued leads about who might have wanted Hammarskjöld dead. They treated this as a simple aviation accident, not as the potential assassination of one of the world's most powerful diplomats. Even though everyone knew Hammarskjöld had enemies, even though the Congo was full of armed groups who saw him as a threat, the United Nations, not satisfied with the Rhodesian findings, conducts its own investigation in 1962. It reviews the same evidence, interviews some of the same witnesses, and reaches essentially the same conclusion. Pilot error, possibly with contributing factors like fatigue or instrument confusion. No evidence of foul play, but buried in the UN report is a remarkable admission. The investigators acknowledge significant uncertainties in the evidence. They note that alternative explanations cannot be completely ruled out. They recommend that if new evidence emerges, the investigation should be reopened. It's a careful, diplomatic way of saying we don't really know what happened, but we're going to call it pilot error because we can't prove anything else. And for the next 30 years, that's where the matter rests. An official verdict that barely anyone believes, covering a crash that makes no sense. Until 1992, when files from apartheid South Africa are finally opened, and investigators discover that the truth about Hammarskjöld's death was known all along. It just wasn't shared. The apartheid government in South Africa has fallen. A new government takes power and begins opening archives that were sealed for decades. Researchers digging through intelligence files from the 1960s make a startling discovery. There are documents about Dag Hammarskjöld's death. Documents that were never shared with the original investigators. These files reveal that South African intelligence operatives discussed plans to remove Hammarskjöld in the months before his death. They describe him as a threat to Western interests in Africa, someone who needed to be stopped. The language is careful, bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. Someone wanted the UN Secretary General dead. The revelations spark renewed interest in the crash. Journalists begin investigating. Researchers file freedom of information requests. And slowly, over the next 2 decades, more evidence emerges from archives around the world. Each new document makes the official story of pilot error harder to believe. In 1998, a Swedish aid worker named Goran Björkdahl begins his own investigation. He spends years tracking down witnesses, examining crash site evidence, and filing requests for classified documents. What he discovers suggests the cover-up goes far deeper than anyone imagined. Björkdahl obtains photographs from the crash site that were never included in the official investigation. One shows a deck of playing cards found near Hammarskjöld's body. The ace of spades has a bullet hole through it. This physical evidence of potential gunfire was never forensically examined. The deck of cards has since disappeared from evidence storage. Other photographs show what appears to be a small, circular wound on Hammarskjöld's forehead, separate from the injuries caused by the crash impact. Modern forensic pathologists who review these images say the wound is consistent with a gunshot. But Hammarskjöld's body was never autopsied. When Björkdahl requests permission to exhume the remains for modern forensic analysis, he's repeatedly denied. In 2011, another piece of the puzzle emerges. A former NSA official named Charles Southall comes forward with a story he's kept secret for 50 years. He was on duty at an NSA listening post in Cyprus on the night of September 17, 1961, monitoring radio communications over Africa. Southall describes hearing a transmission from a pilot in a small aircraft, speaking in French-accented English. The pilot reported he was pursuing another plane. Minutes later, another transmission. "I've hit it. There are flames. She's going down. She's crashing." Southall immediately filed a report with his superiors. That report, if it still exists, has never been declassified. When Southall's testimony becomes public, the NSA issues a carefully worded statement neither confirming nor denying his account. They don't release the relevant communications intercepts. They don't open their files from that night. They simply say they have nothing to add. Similar patterns emerge with other intelligence agencies. The CIA releases a partial file on Hammarskjöld in 2014, heavily redacted. The readable sections confirm that CIA operatives were tracking Hammarskjöld's movements in the days before his death. The redacted sections cover what the CIA knew about threats to his life. British intelligence has even more to hide. In 1992, a former MI6 officer named Daphne Park gives an interview where she admits the UK might have played a role in Hammarskjöld's death. She describes the UN Secretary-General as a threat to British interests in Africa. When pressed for details, she says she's already said too much. She dies in 2010 before providing a full account. The British government continues to classify documents related to the crash. Freedom of information requests are denied on grounds of national security. In 2015, researchers discover that entire files on the Hammarskjöld case were destroyed in the 1980s, supposedly as part of routine records management. The timing is convenient. The files were destroyed just before new transparency laws would have required their eventual release. Belgium also has files it won't release. The Belgian intelligence service tracked Hammarskjöld's movements in the Congo. Belgian mining companies had the most to lose from his policies. Belgian mercenaries were flying combat missions in Katanga. But when researchers request access to relevant archives, they're told the documents can't be found. By 2015, the weight of circumstantial evidence has become overwhelming. The UN, facing pressure from member states and researchers, agrees to reopen the investigation. A new panel is appointed to review all available evidence and make recommendations. The panel spends 2 years examining documents, interviewing witnesses, and pursuing new leads. Their conclusion, released in 2017, is stunning. They find significant evidence that the Albertina may have been shot down. They identify several plausible suspects, including white mercenary pilots operating in the region, and they make a formal request. All member states should immediately declassify their files on the Hammarskjöld case. Most countries refuse. The United States releases a few more heavily redacted documents. Britain releases nothing. Belgium claims it has no additional files to release. South Africa says relevant documents were destroyed during the transition from apartheid. Russia, which presumably has Soviet-era intelligence on the crash, doesn't respond to the request. As of 2026, 65 years after Hammarskjöld's death, the full truth remains locked in classified archives. Someone knows what happened that night. Someone has the documents, the intercepts, the evidence that could definitively answer whether this was murder or accident. They're just not sharing, which raises a final, uncomfortable question. What's in those files that's so dangerous it must remain secret after 6 decades? What truth are they still protecting? And who are they protecting it from? To find Hammarskjöld's killer, you have to understand Katanga in 1961. This wasn't a conventional war zone with uniformed armies and clear battle lines. It was a lawless territory controlled by mining companies, run by a puppet government, and defended by some of the most dangerous men in Africa. White mercenaries who fought for money and asked no questions about who they killed. These weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were veterans of colonial wars, men who'd fought in Indochina, Algeria, Kenya, men who knew how to fly combat aircraft, how to conduct night raids, how to make people disappear. And they were very, very good at their jobs. The largest mercenary force in Katanga was led by a man named Bob Denard, a French ex-soldier who would later become infamous for staging coups across Africa. Under him were pilots, many of them South African or Rhodesia, who flew old fighter planes and bombers against UN forces. They operated with complete impunity, protected by mining companies who paid them and intelligence agencies who looked the other way. UN peacekeepers had been attacked by these mercenary pilots before. They flew at night to avoid detection. They struck without warning. And they had access to weapons sophisticated enough to bring down a DC-6. The question isn't whether they had the capability to shoot down Hammarskjöld's plane. The question is whether they had the order. One name keeps appearing in witness statements and intelligence reports. Jan van Rissegem, a South African pilot working for the Katangan Air Force. Multiple sources describe him as an aggressive flyer, someone who took risks others wouldn't. And in the years after 1961, several people claim he bragged about shooting down the UN Secretary General. These claims are impossible to verify while Van Rissegem is alive because he consistently denies involvement. But after his death in 2007, researchers digging through his personal effects make a discovery. Letters to family members where he hints at participation in a mission against a high-value UN target in September 1961. Nothing explicit enough to be definitive, but suggestive enough to make him the prime suspect. Belgian investigators formally identify Van Rissegem as a person of interest in 2019. They trace his movements on September 17, 1961. He was flying that night. His aircraft, a smaller and faster plane than the Albertina, was armed. And multiple witnesses place a small aircraft near the crash site around the time Hammarskjöld's plane went down. But here's the crucial question. If Van Rissegem shot down the Albertina, who gave him the order? Mercenaries don't conduct assassination missions on their own initiative. Someone hired them. Someone pointed them at Hammarskjöld and said, "Stop him." The trail leads back to the mining companies. Union Miniere and other corporations operating in Katanga had billions at stake. If Hammarskjöld succeeded in reunifying the Congo, they would lose control of the mines that made them rich. They had motive, they had money, and they had access to the mercenaries who had capability. But mining companies don't operate in a vacuum. They have connections to governments, to intelligence agencies, to the diplomatic structures that shape foreign policy. Which means if corporate interests wanted Hammarskjöld dead, they would have needed at least tacit approval from their home governments. Britain, Belgium, the United States, the same countries now refusing to declassify their files. A pattern emerges from the evidence. Multiple parties had motive to kill Hammarskjöld. Multiple parties had the means, but they also needed something else: plausible deniability. They needed a way to eliminate him that wouldn't obviously point back to them. A plane crash during a night flight over Africa, in the middle of a war zone, would be perfect. Could be blamed on pilot error, or on mechanical failure, or on the chaos of the Congo crisis. As long as the evidence was properly managed, as long as witnesses were ignored and investigations steered toward the right conclusion, it would look like a tragic accident. And that's exactly what happened. But someone made a mistake. They didn't count on Harold Julian surviving long enough to talk. They didn't anticipate local villagers witnessing the attack. They couldn't predict that 60 years later, researchers would still be digging, still asking questions, still demanding answers. And they couldn't destroy all the evidence. Some of it survived in classified files. Some of it exists in the memories of people who were there. Some of it is physical, buried in the African soil at the crash site. In 2013, a team of researchers returns to the crash location in Zambia. Using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, they search the area where the Albertina fell. And they find something that the original investigators missed. Fragments of metal embedded in trees near the crash site. Metal that shows signs of high-velocity impact. The fragments are sent to laboratories for analysis. The results are consistent with ammunition from heavy machine guns or cannon fire, the kind of weapons mounted on combat aircraft in 1961. This is physical evidence of an attack, found at the scene, confirming exactly what Harold Julian and the local witnesses described. It should be the smoking gun. Instead, it becomes another piece of evidence that's acknowledged but not acted upon. The UN notes the findings in its 2017 report. Then it does nothing with them, because proving the plane was shot down is only half the battle. The harder part is proving who gave the order. And for that, you need the classified files that no one will release. Among all the mysteries surrounding Hammarskjöld's death, one stands out for its sheer strangeness: the missing briefcase. Hammarskjöld was carrying a leather attaché case containing his notes for the Chambé meeting. Multiple witnesses saw him board the Albertina with it. After the crash, it was never found. This isn't like the other missing evidence. Documents can be destroyed. Witness testimony can be suppressed. but a physical object that disappeared from a crash site where every piece of wreckage was supposedly cataloged. That suggests someone deliberately removed it, and that raises an obvious question. What was in those notes that someone didn't want discovered? UN officials who worked with Hammarskjöld described the briefcase as essential to his work style. He kept everything in there: meeting notes, diplomatic cables, personal observations. He would review these documents before important negotiations, using them to prepare his strategy. The notes for the Chambe meeting would have contained his bottom line, his negotiating position, possibly intelligence about Katangan operations. If you wanted to know what Hammarskjöld was planning to offer Chambe, or what he knew about Western support for Katangan secession, those notes would tell you. They would also reveal how much the UN had discovered about the mining company's involvement in the conflict. In the wrong hands, this information would be valuable. Valuable enough to steal from a crash site. But there's a darker possibility. What if the briefcase was removed not to learn what Hammarskjöld knew, but to hide what he knew? What if his notes contained evidence of a conspiracy against him? What if he documented threats, suspicious incidents, warnings from intelligence sources? Taking those notes would eliminate evidence that might point to murder. Göran Björkdahl, the Swedish investigator who spent years researching the crash, became obsessed with the missing briefcase. He interviewed everyone who was at the crash site in the first hours after the rescue teams arrived. And he found something disturbing. Several witnesses remember seeing a briefcase near the wreckage. They remember it being picked up by someone, possibly a Rhodesian security official. And then it vanished. The official investigation never mentions a briefcase. It's not listed in the inventory of personal effects recovered from the crash. It's as if it never existed. But Hammarskjöld's UN colleagues are adamant. He had it when he boarded. Multiple flight crew members and passengers saw it. So where did it go? Björkdahl files Freedom of Information requests trying to trace the briefcase through official channels. The responses are revealing in their evasiveness. Rhodesian authorities say they have no record of such an item. British intelligence, which worked closely with Rhodesian security services, claims no knowledge. The UN itself has no documentation about what happened to Hammarskjöld's personal effects from the flight. It's possible the briefcase was destroyed in the crash, burned beyond recognition in the fire. But other documents survived the impact and the fire. Papers from other passengers' briefcases were recovered. Why not Hammarskjöld's? And why is there no official record of anyone even looking for it? There's another missing piece of evidence that's equally suspicious. Hammarskjöld's body showed signs of having been moved after death. The position where he was found doesn't match the pattern of how other passengers were thrown from their seats. It's almost as if someone searched him before the rescue teams arrived. Witnesses who saw the body describe his clothing as disheveled, pockets turned out. The official explanation is that this happened during the crash. But crash investigators say the pattern is wrong. The level of disturbance suggests deliberate searching, not crash trauma. Someone was looking for something, possibly the briefcase, possibly documents he might have been carrying on his person. Then there are the photographs. Multiple photos were taken at the crash site before the bodies were removed. These should show exactly what was recovered and where it was found. But when researchers try to access the complete photographic record, they discover that key images are missing from the official archive, including several that supposedly showed items near Hammarskjöld's body. Were those missing photographs showing the briefcase? Were they removed because they would have proven it existed and then disappeared? Or is there something else in those images that someone doesn't want examined? In 2011, a retired Rhodesian intelligence officer gives an anonymous interview to a Belgian journalist. He claims he was at the crash site in the hours after it was discovered. He describes seeing Hammarskjöld's briefcase being taken by a senior security official who worked for British intelligence. When asked what happened to it, the officer says it was sent to London and he never saw it again. The journalist tries to verify this account. The British government refuses to comment. So somewhere in a classified archive in London or Washington or Brussels, Hammarskjöld's notes from September 1961 might still exist. They might contain the names of people who threatened him. They might reveal intelligence about who wanted him dead. They might explain why he felt the need to travel under a false name and keep his flight secret. Or they might simply contain negotiating strategies for a meeting that never happened. We'll never know. Because 6 decades later, no one will release them. The most damning evidence of a cover-up isn't what investigators found. It's what they didn't find. Or more precisely, what they failed to find for 15 hours while one man died slowly in the wreckage with a story to tell. Think about this timeline carefully. The Albertina goes silent at 10:15 p.m. on September 17th. Air traffic control in Dola knows immediately that something is wrong. They have a UN aircraft carrying the Secretary General that has stopped communicating 9 miles from the airport. In any normal scenario, this triggers an immediate emergency response. The first search aircraft doesn't take off until after sunrise. That's 8 hours later. Ground teams don't begin searching until mid-morning. And when they do search, they somehow miss wreckage that's visible from the air, in an area where multiple witnesses reported seeing fire the previous night. The crash site is finally located at 3 p.m. on September 18th, 15 hours after the plane went silent. 15 hours, during which Harold Julian was alive and conscious at various points, during which he could have been rescued with proper medical care, during which he could have given a complete, recorded testimony about what he saw. Instead, he was left to die in the African bush while search teams looked in the wrong places. This wasn't incompetence. Incompetence is searching the wrong area. Incompetence is having communication failures between search teams. What happened here was systematic and deliberate. The search was designed to fail, at least for long enough to ensure that anyone who survived the crash wouldn't survive long enough to talk. Evidence for this comes from multiple sources. Local residents reported seeing and hearing the crash around 10:30 p.m. They saw fire in the forest. Some even tried to investigate but were turned away by armed men in the area. When they reported this to authorities, they were ignored. Their testimony wasn't included in the official timeline. Search aircraft flew over the crash site multiple times during the day on September 18th. Pilots later admitted they saw smoke but were told to keep searching further north, along the expected flight path. When one pilot insisted he'd spotted something in the southwest area, he was ordered to continue the original search pattern. By the time permission was given to investigate the smoke, it was afternoon. Who gave these orders? Who decided that searchers should focus on the wrong area despite evidence pointing elsewhere? The official investigation never asks these questions. The search delays are attributed to the difficulty of air search in forest terrain. But 9 miles from a major airport with smoke visible from the sky, in clear weather, that explanation doesn't hold up. Then there's the question of who reached the crash site first. The official record says rescue teams arrived around 3 p.m. and immediately found the wreckage. But local witnesses tell a different story. They describe seeing vehicles in the area earlier in the day, possibly as early as mid-morning. They describe armed men who appeared to be searching the forest, who told locals to stay away. If this is true, it means someone found the crash site hours before the official rescue team arrived. Someone who had time to search the wreckage, remove evidence, possibly even search the bodies. And then they left, allowing the official teams to discover the site later and find only what they were meant to find. Harold Julian's survival complicates this timeline. If the crash site was found and searched early in the day, the searchers would have encountered Julian, alive and able to talk. Which means either the early search didn't happen, or the people conducting it deliberately left him there to die. Both possibilities are horrifying. Consider what Julian could have revealed with immediate rescue and proper medical care. He was conscious and lucid in the hours after the crash. He could have described exactly what he saw, heard, and felt. He could have confirmed or denied whether there was an explosion or gunfire. He could have provided details about the flight's final moments that would have made the truth impossible to hide. Instead, he was left in the wreckage while search teams looked elsewhere. By the time he reached a hospital, his injuries were so severe that death was inevitable. His testimony became fragmentary, dismissed as the confused memories of a dying man. Whether this was intentional or merely a tragic result of search delays is impossible to prove. But the pattern fits too neatly with a cover-up to be coincidence. And then there's the matter of the radio. The Albertina had multiple radio systems, including an emergency beacon that should have activated automatically on impact. This beacon would have allowed search teams to locate the wreckage within hours, possibly minutes. The investigation found that the emergency beacon failed to activate. Why? Mechanical failure is possible, but the beacon system on a DC-6 is robust and simple. It's designed to survive crashes. For it to fail completely suggests either catastrophic damage to that specific system or deliberate sabotage before the flight. Neither possibility appears in the official investigation. What we're left with is a search operation that failed in ways that benefited anyone who wanted the truth about the crash suppressed. Witnesses were ignored. Evidence was left undiscovered for hours. The one survivor was allowed to die without proper documentation of his testimony. And all of this happened while the world waited to learn the fate of the UN Secretary General. By the time the truth about the delays emerged years later, it was too late. The people who made the decisions were retired or dead. The records were incomplete or classified, and any attempt to investigate the search operation ran into the same wall of secrecy that surrounded every other aspect of the crash. But the 15-hour delay remains one of the most suspicious elements of the entire case. Because it served a purpose. It gave time for evidence to be removed. It allowed witnesses to die. And it ensured that by the time official investigators arrived, the scene was exactly as someone wanted it to be. The missing briefcase, the ignored witnesses, the delayed search, each piece of evidence points to a cover-up. But these were tactical measures, actions taken at the crash site and in the immediate aftermath. The real conspiracy, the one that made Hammarskjöld's death possible, operated at a much higher level. And its fingerprints lead directly to London. Britain had more reasons to want Hammarskjöld dead than any other Western power. The UK's entire post-colonial strategy in Africa depended on maintaining influence through puppet regimes and mining contracts. Hammarskjöld's vision of genuine African independence threatened that model. And in Katanga specifically, British mining interests stood to lose enormous sums if the province was forced to rejoin the Congo. But Britain also had something else: the intelligence infrastructure to make an assassination look like an accident. MI6 operated extensively in Central and Southern Africa. They had assets in Rhodesian security services. They had contacts with mercenary groups. And they had a track record of eliminating people who threatened British interests. The evidence of British involvement starts with Daphne Park. In 1992, she was a retired MI6 officer living in Oxford. During a casual conversation with a colleague, she made a startling admission. She said the British government might have played a role in Hammarskjöld's death. When pressed for details, she said the UN Secretary General had become a problem for British interests in the Congo. This wasn't a definitive confession. Park was careful with her words. But she was also a professional intelligence officer who understood the implications of what she was saying. She wouldn't have mentioned British involvement unless she knew it to be true. The question is, how much did she know? Park served in the Congo during the period leading up to Hammarskjöld's death. Her official role was monitoring political developments for the Foreign Office. Her actual role, according to declassified documents, involved liaising with anti-communist forces and gathering intelligence on UN operations. She would have been in a position to know about any British plots against Hammarskjöld. But Park died in 2010 before providing any additional details. Her memoirs, published posthumously, make no mention of the Hammarskjöld case. And MI6 has refused to release any files related to her work in the Congo during this period. The official position is that such files either don't exist or remain classified for reasons of national security. The British cover-up goes beyond just hiding documents. In the 1980s, during a routine archive review, MI6 destroyed entire file series related to operations in Central Africa during the early 1960s. The official explanation was records management, old files being purged to make space. The timing was convenient. The files were destroyed just before new freedom of information laws would have eventually required their release. What was in those files? We'll never know, but we can make educated guesses based on what has survived. Declassified Foreign Office documents from 1961 show British officials discussing Hammarskjöld in hostile terms. They describe him as increasingly troublesome and naive about communist infiltration. One memo suggests that his removal from office would benefit British interests. These documents don't explicitly call for assassination, but they establish motive and intent. British officials wanted Hammarskjöld gone. They believed his policies threatened their interests, and they had the means to act on that belief through intelligence services with a proven willingness to conduct covert operations. Then there's the question of Rhodesian involvement. Northern Rhodesia in 1961 was still a British protectorate. Its security services answered to London. Its air traffic control system was staffed by British-trained personnel. If the crash was indeed sabotage, and if the subsequent search delays were deliberate, British intelligence would have had to coordinate with Rhodesian authorities. Evidence suggests this coordination occurred. Multiple witnesses describe seeing British security officials at the crash site before the official rescue teams arrived. Rhodesian air traffic control recordings from the night of the crash have never been released, despite multiple requests. And the Rhodesian investigation, which concluded pilot error despite contradictory evidence, was overseen by a judge with close ties to British colonial administration. The pattern suggests a conspiracy that operated across multiple levels. At the tactical level, mercenary pilots conducted the actual attack. At the operational level, Rhodesian security services managed the crash site and investigation. At the strategic level, British intelligence coordinated the overall operation and ensured the cover-up held. This is speculation, built on circumstantial evidence and the statements of people like Daphne Park. But it's speculation that fits the facts better than any alternative explanation. Because the alternative, that this was all a tragic accident, that the investigation failures were mere incompetence, that the missing evidence is coincidence, requires believing in an impossible series of coincidences. The British conspiracy theory also explains something that simple accident or mercenary action cannot: the sustained, decades-long cover-up. Individual mercenaries might kill for money and then keep quiet out of self-preservation. But the systematic suppression of evidence across multiple governments for 60-plus years requires institutional support. It requires intelligence agencies continuing to classify files. It requires governments refusing to cooperate with UN investigations. It requires a shared commitment to ensuring the truth never emerges. Britain had the motive, the means, and the ongoing institutional interest in keeping this secret. Because if it comes out that MI6 assassinated a UN Secretary General, the diplomatic consequences would be catastrophic. Not just historically, but for Britain's current role in international institutions. It would be a scandal that would undermine British credibility for generations. So the files stay classified. The witnesses who knew the truth have mostly died. And the British government continues to deny any involvement while refusing to release the documents that might prove or disprove the allegation. But they made one mistake. They didn't count on Daphne Park's moment of candor. That single admission, "We might have played a role," is enough to keep the investigation alive, because it confirms what researchers have suspected all along. This wasn't just about Katanga or mining companies or mercenary pilots. This conspiracy reached the highest levels of British intelligence. And if London was involved, who else knew? Who else participated? The trail doesn't end in Britain. It leads across the Atlantic to Washington and to the most powerful intelligence agency in the world. The CIA didn't trust Dag Hammarskjöld. Internal memos from the late 1950s and early 1960s paint a picture of an agency increasingly concerned about the UN Secretary General's independence. He wasn't anti-American exactly, but he wasn't reliably pro-American either. And in the zero-sum logic of Cold War intelligence, that made him a potential threat. The concern centered on Hammarskjöld's willingness to work with non-aligned nations and his refusal to automatically support Western positions. When he negotiated with China to free American POWs, the CIA worried he was being manipulated by communist intelligence. When he created UN peacekeeping forces, they feared these troops could be used against American allies. And when he committed the UN to reunifying the Congo, they saw him interfering with strategic mineral resources critical to Western defense. A declassified CIA assessment from August 1961, just weeks before Hammarskjöld's death, describes him as idealistic to the point of being dangerous. The document discusses his plans for the Congo and concludes that his success would have negative implications for Western interests in the region. This is bureaucratic language for, "We have a problem that needs solving." How far was the CIA willing to go to solve that problem? This is where the evidence becomes both more substantial and more heavily redacted. The CIA released a partial file on Hammarskjöld in 2014. Large sections are blacked out, but the readable portions confirm that the agency was tracking his movements in the days before his death. They knew about the Ndola flight before it happened. They were monitoring the situation in real time. What they won't release is what they did with that information. Did the CIA share intelligence about the flight with anyone who might have acted on it? Did they have advanced knowledge of a plot against Hammarskjöld? Did they participate in planning or executing such a plot? The redacted sections might answer these questions. But the CIA's position is that releasing this information would compromise intelligence sources and methods, even 60 years later. There's another piece of evidence that points toward CIA involvement. Charles Southall, the NSA officer who heard radio communications suggesting Hammarskjöld's plane was shot down, didn't just hear those transmissions by accident. He was part of a larger signals intelligence operation monitoring the Congo crisis. And that operation was coordinated with the CIA. Southall describes immediately reporting what he heard to his superiors. His report would have been shared with other intelligence agencies, including the CIA. This means that within hours of Hammarskjöld's death, American intelligence knew, or at least strongly suspected, that he had been shot down. Yet the official U.S. position supported the pilot error conclusion. Why would American intelligence suppress evidence of an assassination? One possibility: they knew about the plot beforehand and chose not to stop it. Another possibility: they were actively involved. A third possibility: they discovered the truth after the fact and decided that revealing it would create diplomatic problems worse than covering it up. Any of these scenarios requires a level of CIA involvement that goes far beyond passive observation. Then there's Allen Dulles, CIA director in 1961. Dulles was a Cold War hardliner who believed in using any means necessary to counter Soviet influence. He had authorized coups, assassinations, and covert operations across the developing world. He had a particular interest in the Congo, which he saw as a critical battleground in the struggle for African resources and political allegiance. On September 16, 1961, one day before Hammarskjöld boarded the Albertina, Dulles met with senior CIA officials to discuss the Congo problem. Notes from that meeting remain classified. We know the meeting happened because it appears in Dulles's official schedule. We don't know what was discussed because the substance is still secret. Was Hammarskjöld mentioned in that meeting? Were options for dealing with him discussed? Did anyone present know that he would be dead within 36 hours? These questions can't be answered without access to the meeting notes. And those notes, if they still exist, remain locked in CIA archives. The pattern across multiple documents is consistent. The CIA viewed Hammarskjöld as problematic. They were tracking his movements. They had advanced knowledge of his fatal flight. They heard intelligence suggesting he was shot down. And then they supported a cover story that contradicted their own information. This doesn't prove CIA involvement in the assassination, but it proves they knew more than they admitted. And it raises a disturbing possibility: that American intelligence allowed a UN Secretary General to be killed because they believed his death served American interests. The relationship between the CIA and the mercenary pilots operating in Katanga provides another connection. These pilots weren't just hired guns working for mining companies. Many had previous relationships with Western intelligence agencies. They had been recruited for covert operations in other conflicts. They had secure communication channels with CIA and MI6 stations across Africa. If the CIA wanted Hammarskjöld's plane shot down, they wouldn't have needed to send American operatives. They could have simply passed information about the flight to assets already in theater. A payment to the right mercenary pilot. A quiet conversation about targets of opportunity. Plausible deniability while achieving the desired outcome. Is this what happened? The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Multiple mercenary pilots had CIA connections. The pilot suspected of shooting down the Albertina, Jan van Rissegem, had previously flown missions that benefited Western intelligence interests. And the intelligence network tracking Hammarskjöld's movements that night included CIA assets. But proving a connection between CIA information and mercenary action would require access to operational cables from September 1961. Those cables, if they exist, remain classified. The CIA's position is that releasing them would reveal intelligence sources whose protection is still necessary. 65 years later, they're still protecting sources involved in events from 1961. What could be so sensitive that it requires eternal classification? The obvious answer: proof of American involvement in assassinating a UN Secretary General. Such proof would be diplomatically catastrophic. It would undermine American moral authority. It would call into question decades of U.S. foreign policy. It would be, quite literally, a secret that could never be revealed. So the CIA continues to hide behind national security classifications. They release documents with all the important parts blacked out. They refuse to confirm or deny Southall's account of the radio intercepts. They maintain that their interest in Hammarskjöld was purely observational, that they had no involvement in his death. But they won't release the files that might prove their innocence. And in the absence of those files, the circumstantial evidence continues to accumulate. Motive, means, opportunity, and a sustained cover-up spanning generations. The CIA had all of them. The question is whether having them is the same as using them. And that's a question only the classified files can answer.